Good evening, everyone, and welcome to lesson number 3 of Outsmarting Anti-Semitism, the Promised Land. So we've established pretty clearly that anti-Semitism has been around for over 3,000 years, and it's taken on many different forms over those 3,000 years. Today, in the modern era, anti-Semitism is very often presented as simply anti-Israel activity. The fact that anti-Semitism has kind of morphed and transformed itself and changed into primarily being directed at Israel is very dangerous. It's very dangerous, of course, for the Jewish people, the 7 million Jewish people who are living in the land of Israel and who are surrounded by enemies. The anti-Israel activity emboldens, strengthens, directs money to to the enemies of the Jewish people, and directs money away from the land of Israel. So it's actively putting 7 million Jews in harm. But it's not just the Jews living in the land of Israel. Jews are attacked, beaten, shot up, businesses are destroyed all over the world, whether in France, whether in Jersey City, or America, Canada, Australia. It doesn't matter where you go, Jews have been attacked all over the world. And what is the backdrop for these attacks? Anti-Israel sentiment and feelings. This leads to a critical question, which is, why Israel? Why is it that Israel is, why people spend so much time focusing on Israel? Now, this question is something which is very, very personal to me. Now, I know it affects every Jew in the world, and it certainly impacts each and every one of you. The reason it affects me very personally is because for 9 years, my wife and I directed the Chabad Jewish Discovery Center in Olympia, Washington. We founded it at the end of the year 2007. A lot of what we did was focused on working with the students at Evergreen State College. I had a Stump the Rabbi. It turned into an Ask the Rabbi booth. I sat in the middle of Evergreen State College for approximately 4 to 5 hours every single Wednesday. We had tons of students over our house, Friday night dinners, various holiday events. Spent a lot of time at the school. I was asked to speak multiple times by various professors, to give lectures, had a fabulous time there. However, this college is notorious for being anti-Israel. And I don't mean 50-50 anti-Israel. I don't mean 60-40 anti-Israel. I don't even mean 75-25. I mean 99.999% dominated by anti-Israel activity. So much so that the first time that I ever went there, when a student was going to give me a tour, a student who did not go to Evergreen, but who lived in Olympia, told me I should not wear my yarmulke. It's not a good place to be a visible Jew. What's the background? So Evergreen State College is a very progressive liberal college and had many professors there who were anti-Israel and who justified suicide bombings in their presentations to the students. So there was already the school was saturated with this anti-Israel tendency. One of the students in the school, her name was Rachel Corey from Olympia. 2003, she is in Gaza, and she is standing in front of a bulldozer that is an Israeli bulldozer that is covering over Hamas terrorist tunnels, which are used to infiltrate into the land of Israel and commit terrorist activities. The way that these bulldozers are designed, there's a blind spot of approximately 30 feet. They're very, very tall, and you can't see right in front. Accidentally, the Israeli bulldozer killed Rachel Corey. She was made into a hero of the Palestinian people. Yasser Arafat spoke at her funeral. There's a statue of her in Olympia, Washington. The Rachel Corey Foundation has been developed, and she is the star of Evergreen State College. The Rachel Corey Foundation brings into Olympia every single anti-Israel speaker on the face of the earth, from the most prominent to the least. Every single week of the year, there is a lecture at Evergreen State College, and then in turn at various places around Olympia, spewing the anti-Israel hatred. There is a protest in downtown Olympia every single week, protesting the state of Israel. In one of the first years that I was there, I met a few students who wanted to make a pro-Israel student group. The group was going to be called SIA Shalom, an acronym for Students Interested in Israel Advocacy and Peace. So they put posters around the school building that said Zionist meeting taking place at whatever Tuesday at 4 o'clock. A lot of the posters were ripped down. They were defaced. Swastikas were put on them. It was very painful to see. And the students were really, really hurt by it, to put swastikas on these things. The next week, the newspaper came out called the Cooper Point Journal, the student newspaper. And in it, one of the students who was on the student council, or the student union representative, said that he tears down any posters that he does not agree with. If it's a capitalist poster, if it's a Zionist poster, he will tear it down. This article created quite a stir that had to do with free speech. Is it correct? Is it okay to tear down posters that you don't agree with if it violates free speech? At the next student union meeting, the students that were pro-Israel who formed this group were going to speak. You have an opportunity, there's an agenda, everyone has an opportunity to present their cause, to present their claim. I go to the meeting, right? It's in a large classroom. It's kind of like a small lecture hall, a large classroom, kind of stadium seating. A lot of people were there, packed, like 200, 300 people. It was packed jam. The meeting begins, and before the meeting can actually develop and follow its pattern, a student gets up from the crowd, goes to the middle of the room, grabs a podium. There was no podium. There was just 3 people from the council at a table, grabs a podium and launches into a 20-minute lecture how Israel is the worst country on the face of the earth, responsible for every crime under the sun. The crowd that was there, right, was cheering like the way it was done when the Romans were sacrificing human beings and animals in the Colosseum. I remember there were people there wearing jackets, leather jackets that had Israeli flags on them, dripping with blood, and all kinds of anti-Israel activities. My heart was beating 100 miles an hour. I was scared. I was shaking. It had a huge effect on me. It was a mob of people who were, there was frothing at the mouth, spit coming out of their mouth in the hatred that they had for the state of Israel and ultimately the Jewish people. This resolution, ultimately, nothing came of it. One of the activities that this group of students did was they made a display promoting the state of Israel that was in the student union building, in the windows of the main bookstore of the campus. So this was a display, right? It was open to as you can see, like a cafeteria kind of eating area. And this was the inside of the building kind of had 2 or 3 floors. And this was like a courtyard or a lobby that was open and people could hang out. So this is the beautiful pro-Israel display that they made with all kinds of quotes. You could see a lot of their stuff actually comes from Stand With Us. I didn't take a picture of it because it was not ready when I took this picture. But you'll notice if you look at your screen to the left, you see a cement kind of divider. Directly on the other side of the cement divider, the windows continue. Not 4 panels. It's either 1 or 2 panels, a smaller section. The anti-Israel group continued the Israeli flag, which you see over here. However, on the Israeli flag, they put a whole bunch of bloody child-size handprints and a bunch of coffins, child-sized coffins, draped with Palestinian flags, and vile and repulsive posters and anti-Israel paraphernalia. Unfortunately, I was not able to get that picture for you. When it was Israel Independence Day, they would put all over the whole green square, which was in front of the campus, a bunch of headstones, like hundreds of headstones and all kinds of posters and anti-Israel stuff, coffins, all that type of stuff. I remember one year they set up this huge display that was highlighting the occupation. The poster said, in 1967, Israel occupied and took over this territory, XYZ, the torture, whatever, the occupation, all that stuff. It did not mention that there was a war. No mention at all. There was no 6-day war. It did not mention at all that there was actually threats, wars, attack, nothing. Just in 1967, out of the blue, Israel took over the area. Right? This was crazy. One morning, Chava leaves the house. She gets in the car. 30 seconds later, she calls me. And she says that the menorah that we have in front of our house, which was also our Chabad house, our 8-foot tall menorah, is knocked over. Please come out and check it out and see what it is. I come outside, I pick up the menorah, which is knocked down, and this is what I see. You want to see it a little bit closer? It said on it, "Die Jew." Right? You cannot be any more specific than that. It was covered in the newspaper. It was covered on TV, Seattle, Olympia, multiple stations, all over the place. I receive a call from the president of Evergreen State College, apologizing for this act of violence that was inflicted on our menorah and the message that was left. Do I know who did it? I have no idea who did it. But the president of the school knows the environment that's cultivated in that school, and it's very easy to connect the dots where that type of messaging leads to. So it affected me very personally in my life, right? And this is an issue that certainly affects us. The anti-Israel is anti-Semitic. It becomes violent. Any Jew is a target anywhere in the world. So a question that I want to focus a little bit on tonight is, why does so much hatred center on Israel? Why do these people who live in Olympia, Washington, like tens of thousands of miles away from Israel, what hurts them, what bothers them, what irks them so much that it becomes an obsession, that it's a 24-hour activity? For a person to care about what goes on in the Middle East, I could understand. A person cares what's going on anywhere in the world. What drives people in Olympia and, of course, in the rest of the world, whether it's in the UN, to have such a focus, such a hatred on the state of Israel? Historically, anti-Semitism took many different forms. The modern era, there's an obsession, there's a focus on the state of Israel, and we got to figure out what it's all about. I want to begin with a really important text from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, text number 1. Mark, would you like to read text number 1? It's on page 84.
I would be glad to.
Thank you.
A mutating virus. Anti-Semitism is not an ideology, a coherent set of beliefs. It is, in fact, an endless stream of contradictions. The best way of understanding it is to see it as a virus. Viruses attack the human body, but the body itself has an immensely sophisticated defense, the human immune system. How then do viruses survive and flourish? By mutating. Anti-Semitism mutates and in so doing defeats the immune system set up by cultures to protect themselves against hatred. Most people at most times feel a residual guilt at hating the innocent. Therefore, anti-Semitism has always had to find legitimation in the most prestigious source of authority at any given time. In the first centuries of the Common Era, and again in the Middle Ages, this was religion. That is why Judeophobia took the form of religious doctrine. In the 19th century, religion had lost prestige, and the supreme authority was now science. Racial anti-Semitism was duly based on two pseudosciences: social Darwinism, the idea that in society and as in nature, the strong survive by eliminating the weak, and the so-called scientific study of race. By the late 20th century, science had lost its prestige, having given us the power to destroy life on Earth. Today, the supreme source of legitimacy is human rights. That is why Jews or the Jewish state are accused of the 5 primal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity.
So Rabbi Sachs explains in this text that you cannot lump anti-Semitism in with racism or any of the other type of bigotries that are common. Most of those other type of bigotries that are out there are simply because they hate people who are different, whatever the type of difference may be. Sometimes it's race, sometimes it's sexual orientation, sometimes it's nationality, sometimes it could be religion. But the common denominator is there are people out there who hate people that are different, and that takes many different forms depending on what the issue is. But Rabbi Sachs says that's not what anti-Semitism is. Anti-Semitism is unique, it's different, and it functions much like a virus. Why and how does this work? There says, first of all, in order for anti-Semitism to be successful, it has to be viewed as seen as legitimate, right? You can't just announce, I hate a particular group of people, we would like to murder them, wipe them out, and depict them as evil. It's not going to fly, it's not going to work. It has to appear kosher, righteous, it has to appear legitimate. So what have anti-Semites done throughout history? It's not just the issue that Jews are different. What they did is, what is the most powerful force in the day? What is the highest value in society today? They co-opted that value and were able to direct it and use it against the Jewish people. In the Middle Ages, when religion is what dominated the day, when religion was the highest value, when religion was the most important thing, when countries were ruled by the church, when countries were ruled by the mosque, the most powerful form of anti-Semitism was religious issues. Whether Jews are infidels, whether they are Christ killers, right? Whatever the particular claim was, when religion was the highest value and was seen as the most legitimate, anti-Semitism became a profoundly religious issue, thereby sanctified, kosher, anti-Semitism became holy. In the 19th century, the world moved away from religion having that same power structure, that same power dynamic. The Enlightenment movement took over. Science, right, began to take on a new form of prominence. All of a sudden, based on pseudoscience and biology, the Jewish people are an inferior race, and you have doctors and scientists pointing out the skull shape, the height, the hair, the nose, the mouth, all kinds of different things. The Jewish people are a illegitimate and inferior race, and from a scientific perspective, they need to be eradicated, they need to be wiped out. When science is the highest value, that was directed against the Jewish people. Late 20th century, what is the value that people are focused on today, perhaps more than any others, and perhaps rightfully so? Human rights issues. The attention of the world is focused on human rights. When human rights is the highest value, the Jewish people, and by extension Israel, become the biggest violators of human rights, the most racist people that exist. Whatever is considered to be of the highest value, that is how anti-Semitism is like that virus. It adapts in order to fit whatever is the highest value. Now, some people may respond and say, wait a minute, right? Very nice article, very nice insight, but you cannot say that anti-Israel criticism is anti-Semitic. It's not right. A person can criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic. And they happen to be right, because it goes without saying that a person can criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic. I personally criticize Israel. I'm sure every one of you has a criticism of Israel. In your book, there is a poll, figure 3.2, and it shows how 59% of people who are pro-Israel have criticisms of the state of Israel. A person should have criticisms of the state of Israel. It is not a perfect place. It is a democracy, and we have to make sure that Israel is heading in the right direction. So there's pretty much not a Jew out there who doesn't have some criticism about a particular policy, law, social issue, cultural issue, religious issue that exists within the land of Israel. So by definition, just criticizing Israel does not make a person anti-Semitic. So this leaves us to this question. How might we differentiate between legitimate criticism of Israel and criticism that's motivated by anti-Semitism? There's a very simple formula to know the answer to this question, And it's stated pretty clearly in a medrash. The medrash is discussing Hadrian. Right? Hadrian was the Roman emperor ruler in the land of Israel. He ruled between the years 117 and 138. So about 50 years after the second temple was destroyed, he was a ruler for a significant period of time. He was a brutal dictator. He was brutal to the Jewish people, tremendous amount of violence. He outlawed the observance of Shabbos. He outlawed the observance of the mitzvah of a bris milah, of getting a circumcision, amongst many other things. One Jew by the name of Imikantron, which we do not know much about, stood up to him, wrote a letter criticizing what he's doing. And this is in text number 2. Alan, would you like to read text number 2? It is on page 88. Got to unmute yourself.
Okay. Imikantron wrote to Emperor Hadrian, "If it is circumcision that you hate, Arabian tribes also circumcise. If it is Shabbat observance that you despise, the Kuthians similarly observe Shabbat. Clearly, then, you simply hate the Jewish people. Their God will exact punishment from you."
So this guy, Imikantron, he says, "Excuse me, Hadrian, you are simply an anti-Semite. That's wrong, and you are wrong." Hadrian defends himself. He says, "What are you talking about? I am not an anti-Semite in any way, shape, or form. All I'm doing is I'm trying to discourage activities that seem to be contrary to Hellenist culture. Any type of rituals that we feel are contrary to the type of society and culture that we want to build and we want to develop, we are outlawing, we're banning. It's not something specific against the Jewish people. I don't hate the Jewish people. It's just these are particular rules that are contrary to the direction that we want society to be in." So Imikantron says to him, "Baloney. You outlawed Jewish people from circumcision, but you have said nothing about Arabs or pagans of the day who circumcised. It happened to be that at that point in time, 500 years before Islam was ever invented, there were pagans and there were Arabs who performed circumcision. Hadrian did not say one word about them. Hadrian says the Jewish people are not allowed to observe Shabbos. Yet there was a whole nother group of people that in that era were called the Kuthians. Today they're known as the Samaritans. Samaritans observe their own version of Shabbos. He said not a word about them. His only issue was with the Jewish people. So therefore he was called out and he said, your decrees have nothing to do with targeting people who are different, targeting people who represent something counterculture, what you're trying to do. You're targeting the Jews because you hate the Jewish people because you're an anti-Semite. If there is a double standard, that is how you know it's not criticism of Israel, it's anti-Semitism. If people who say they're criticizing Israel because of what they perceive as major human rights violations, what they perceive as racism, yet they ignore China and Afghanistan and North Korea and any other places on earth that actually have real slavery, kill, murder, whip people, and discriminate against women and so on, if their focus is on Israel and ignore those other countries, that is your first indication. It is motivated by hatred of the Jewish people. It's blanket anti-Semitism, nothing more and nothing less. Natan Sharansky, right, developed a simple test. How do you test if a person is just criticizing Israel, they're anti-Semitic? He calls it the 3D test. Karen, would you like to read the 3D test? Text number 3 on page 89.
Sure. I believe that we can apply a simple test. I call it the 3D test to help us distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism. The first D is the test of demonization. When the Jewish state is being demonized, when Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportion, when comparisons are made between Israelis and Nazis and between Palestinian refugee camps and Auschwitz, this is anti-Semitism, not legitimate criticism of Israel. The second D is the test of double standards. When criticism of Israel is applied selectively, when Israel is singled out by the United Nations for human rights abuses, while the behavior of known and major abusers, such as China, Iran, Cuba, and Syria, is ignored, when Israel's Mogen David Adom, alone among the world's ambulance services, is denied admission to the International Red Cross, this is anti-Semitism. The third D is the test of delegitimization. When Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied, alone among all peoples in the world, this too is anti-Semitism.
So Natan Sharansky gives us a very simple way of looking at it. It's called the 3D test. If what the critic of Israel is saying is ultimately a demonization of the state of Israel, making it evil, right, involving it to some type of crazy conspiracy, this is anti-Semitism. If the state of Israel is compared to Nazis, to concentration camps, that is flat out anti-Semitism. If people are saying that Israeli soldiers shoot children for fun and for entertainment, this is anti-Semitism. It's not rooted in reality. If the claim is somehow Israel runs the world, Jews run the world, Jewish money controls Congress, and so on, this is called anti-Semitism. These ideas go so far and so crazy, and I heard this claim myself. An anti-Israel activist said that there was an incredible study that was done about Israeli soldiers' treatment of Palestinians. There is not a single case, not one, of an Israeli soldier raping a Palestinian woman. You know what this anti-Israel activist said that proves? It proves that Israeli soldiers are so racist, they hate the Palestinians so much that they would not even rape them because they're so beneath them. That's anti-Semitism. This is distortion. This is derangement. This is demonization. Then there is the double standards. If these people who are frothing at the mouth, who protest against Israel every single week, if China doesn't exist to them, if Afghanistan doesn't exist for them, if Syria does not exist for them, if North Korea does not exist for them, clear double standard, it's anti-Semitism. People talk about the occupation of the West Bank as a violation of UN Charter, is it 40, Article 49, 6, if I'm not mistaken. They say Israel has violated this charter. Besides the fact that there's a legal debate as to the definition of this, the only time this charter has ever been invoked in the entire United Nations is the West Bank and Gaza. There's not a single other country that is engaged with an issue of occupation that the UN has pointed out besides the state of Israel. Clear and obvious double standard. And then finally, the last D is delegitimization. If a person says that Israel has no right to exist, it's pure anti-Semitism. Now, what's interesting to me is this point was actually made not by a pro-Israel activist, by one of the fiercest critics of Israel, a person who I would say is very much a self-hating Jew. His name is Norman Finkelstein. I'm going to mention him a little bit later. When the BDS movement really started taking off, he opposed it. And people couldn't understand. Norman Finkelstein, the most outspoken critic of Israel, enemy, arch enemy of Alan Dershowitz, how could he be against the BDS movement? And he said very simple, Israel is a legitimate state with the right to exist. He hates it. He thinks it's evil, but you cannot say it's illegitimate. And the BDS movement, their foundation is to say that it's illegitimate. And he said, if you are going from the perspective of BDS movement, even Norman Finkelstein got it. If your perspective is BDS, by definition, it is anti-Semitic, and the criticism is ultimately dismissed in that fashion. So these are important methods how we could identify what's anti-Israel criticism versus what is in fact anti-Semitic. So what can we do about it? It's a big issue. It's out there. It's getting worse and it's growing. So some things that we can do is support organizations that help advance Israel's interests. Stand With Us is one of them that I was very involved with. There are many organizations out there that do good work, that try to help promote Israel. They work in PR, they print materials, they distribute it, they deal with education. Supporting Israel economically is important. That means buying Israeli products, going to Israel, spending your money there, right? Doing what you can to strengthen Israel. There are various lobbyist organizations that work hard to secure Israel's interests. These are all good things. Engage in spiritual endeavors to support Jews in Israel. The Rebbe launched the campaign for Jewish men to put on tefillin in 1967, before the Six-Day War. He said, this is a mitzvah where the Torah teaches that as protective power for the Jewish people, and specifically the land of Israel, do mitzvahs for the land of Israel. So these are all good things that we can do to try to help the issue. Now, what we are going to focus on specifically today, with what we can do about it, is a very painful issue, which is Jews that have joined forces with the anti-Semites who hate the state of Israel, and by extension to Jewish people. The anti-Israel non-Jewish movement, whether the BDS or in politics, we're going to talk more about that next week. So next week, we're going to talk about politicians that are anti-Israel and so on. What we're going to focus on today is what can we do about Jews who join forces with haters? How do we understand them? What's their motivation? And what response could we possibly have? It's incredibly painful to see, to witness, to hear Jews speak with such hatred to the Jewish people and actively helping, like literally helping the enemies of the Jewish people who are willing to do violence against the Jewish people. In Evergreen, I saw this time and time again. A Jewish student that I was friendly with, I reached out, I tried to engage him. He was working for the Rachel Corrie Foundation. He was studying the conflict in the Middle East. He was part and parcel of organizing the BDS movement. I said, it's Hanukkah. We're having a menorah lighting in downtown Olympia. Come, the mayor's coming. There's dignitaries that are coming. There's latkes, there's donuts, there's music. That's it. No political speeches. We're just celebrating Hanukkah. He said, I cannot come and I will not come. I said, why? Because there are people there who are pro-Israel. He cannot go to an event that has people there that are pro-Israel. He can't. The lens which he views everything in life is this political lens. Being at an event with pro-Israel people would somehow be a conflict that he cannot overcome. A Jew can't be together with other Jews. Painful, it hurts. The Stand With Us, Chabad of Olympia, and as well as Temple Beth Tfilah, and some Jewish professors at Evergreen organized a meeting. Students, faculty, people, let's talk about the craziness that's going on about Israel on campus. What can we do about it? So we have a meeting. It was in a classroom. There's only about 25 or so people there. It wasn't very well attended. Me, maybe one or two other rabbis, some students, some community members, some professors. In that group was the head of the BDS movement on campus. The head of the BDS movement on campus, there was a few who were heads. One of them was Jewish. And one of the points that she made is she will not collaborate in any way, shape, or form, not with Chabad, not with Hillel, not with a non-denominational student group, because by that time, the Jewish student group at Evergreen State College was not affiliated with Hillel. It was not affiliated with Chabad. I went to every meeting, but it had no affiliation. It was just Jews on campus, because they knew that otherwise there's no way it's going to work. And what this Jewish student says, she will not step foot even into the Reconstructionist temple. Now, the rabbi in the Reconstructionist temple that year in Rosh Hashanah, in the sermon that he made, right, he said that we're a very open congregation. People with a diverse group, diverse opinions are welcome. There's one group of people who are not welcome, who cannot step foot into our temple, and that is people who are anti the LGBTQ movement. They're not well, they cannot step foot in. Says if you're anti-Israel, you're welcome. You support the BDS movement, you're welcome. Right? He said this in his Rosh Hashanah speech. Yet this girl said she would not step foot into that building, and she would not have anything to do or partner with any group in any way, shape, or form because of that anti-Israel activity. It's mind-boggling. The 50th anniversary, sorry, the 60th anniversary of Israel, 2008, the BDS movement, the anti-Israel group, Rachel Corrie Foundation, they brought Norman Finkelstein to speak. This was before the BDS movement became popular, and he was at that time the hero of the anti-Israel movement. Today, not so popular anymore because he doesn't like BDS. He got up, the biggest lecture hall in the school, packed, and he said that Israel is the worst country on the face of the earth. It's worse than the worst dictatorship in Africa, the worst of the worst. At the end of the lecture, right, a Jewish student, one who I had over for many, many a Friday night after the story, I actually drove him home from the event, and I changed his mind later. He got up and he said, "Thank you so much for representing the real Jewish opinion on the state of Israel." You could cringe. I'm telling you, I went to these events, I could not sleep afterwards. Why does this happen? And what can we do about it? What's so dangerous about it is it gives anti-Israel movements legitimacy and it gives them strength, because they say, how can you accuse us of being anti-Semitic? Some of us are Jewish. I'm Jewish, right? There's Jews that are a part of it. You cannot accuse it of being anti-Semitic if Jewish people are a part of it. So it makes it more scary and even more dangerous. In order to understand what motivates them, why it's happening, and ultimately what we can do about it, we are going to look back into Jewish history. We are going to compare two different types of anti-Semitism. In last class, we looked at some anti-Semitism as expressed in the Megillah. There was Haman style, there was Achashverosh style. Tonight, we're going to look at Purim style anti-Semitism versus Hanukkah style anti-Semitism. First, Purim. What is Purim style anti-Semitism? The agenda of Purim style anti-Semitism is to destroy the Jewish people. The classic biblical example is Haman and Achashverosh. They wanted to destroy every man, woman, and child. The modern day example of Purim style anti-Semitism, the Nazis. Are there anti-Israel activists today who would fit into the category of Purim style anti-Semitism, who literally want to destroy and wipe out the Jewish people? Absolutely yes. The leader of Hezbollah actually said he wishes and he hopes that every single Jew on earth would come to the land of Israel. Says, you know why? That way it's much easier to wipe them out. You don't have to go all over the whole world and chase down each and every single one of them. So yes, there is a segment, there's a group in the anti-Israel movement that actually is Purim-style anti-Semitism who literally wants to destroy the Jewish people. Do Jews join this particular type of anti-Israel activity? Probably not, right? It's a much more difficult sell to get a Jew to join a group that the goal of the group is literally to kill every single Jew. Can't say it's never happened, but that's typically not the type of anti-Israel group that the Jew is going to be attracted to or the Jew is going to join, although I bet, unfortunately, it happened. There's another type of anti-Semitism which could be called Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism. What took place during the holiday of Hanukkah? So first of all, it took place approximately in the year 150 before the Common Era. That's when the events of Hanukkah unfolded. The agenda of Antiochus was to Hellenize the Jewish people. The Jewish people were a bit stubborn. They were not assimilating into the Hellenistic culture of the day. He wanted to Hellenize them. He was not interested in killing Jews. He was not interested in murdering people. That was not his agenda at all. What did he want to do? He wanted to eradicate specific beliefs and practices. In that culture, they were Syrian Greeks. They worshipped the body. They had all kinds of sporting events, Olympics, whatever you want to call it, in arenas, and the people competed in the nude, right? The beauty of the physical body was something worshipped. So they found the idea of circumcision to be abhorrent. It's repulsive. You're desecrating, you're ruining, you're destroying the body. So let's get rid of circumcision. He didn't want to kill Jews. Let's get rid of circumcision. In that culture, there were idols. Idols, statues were all over the place. Why not have idols in the temple? Whatever were the prominent Syrian, Greek, pagan gods and idols, put them in the temple. Be part of culture. Be part of society. That was their issue. He wanted Jews to just do more Syrian and Greek stuff. Killing Jews was not part of the agenda. His issue was eradicating specific practices and beliefs. For a Jew to join into a group of this type of anti-Semites that's targeting anti-Semitism from this perspective and from this angle, it's a lot easier to do. Why is it easier to do? And why would Jews join in? Number one, you don't have to renounce your Judaism. Antiochus did not say, you must give up being Jewish. He said, be Jewish. Just don't have a circumcision. Be Jewish. Just put some idols into your temple. It's not an issue. You don't have to renounce your Judaism. It's much easier to join this type of group if you don't have to renounce your Judaism. Not only that, you could be a proud Jew. You could be a proud Jew because, in fact, you think you're saving Judaism by eradicating outdated, what you believe to be outdated Jewish practices that don't line up with current modern values. You think you're preserving Judaism. You're securing a future for the Jewish people. So you don't have to renounce it. And in fact, you actually think that you are saving Judaism. Historically, many Jews who joined these type of groups, they even supported violence against Jews who didn't conform. Again, this was not an issue of destroying the Jewish race. This was simply, they even participated in violence against Jews who didn't go along with it. Not only that, they were not particularly concerned about the double standard. Antiochus did not make any decrees against any other people besides Jews. He did not make any other decrees banning and barring any particular cultural issues against any other people that were under his control or under his territory. It was only against the Jews. Nowhere else did he use violence to put down, to harm, to injure any other culture. This still did not bother the Jews. Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism has occurred time and time again throughout Jewish history. When this style of anti-Semitism occurs, unfortunately, there have been Jews who are eager to join. One, because you're not advocating murder of the Jewish people. And they're just advocating changing some beliefs, and they viewed it as actually saving Judaism. But not only that, in addition to that, it is perceived to be a sophisticated worldview. The Jews who joined felt, again, that not only are they not hurting, but they are helping secure a Jewish future. They viewed themselves as being sophisticated, modern, progressive, absolutely at the height of culture. Let's go to text number 4, where this is explained in a little bit more detail. Who would like to read? Larry, would you like to read by any chance? Or Karen?
I'm sorry, did you ask me to read again?
Yes.
We don't have the
like
book, sorry.
Larry Broad or Karen Broad.
We don't have the book with us, I'm sorry.
Oh, you don't have the book with you. Okay. All right, Phil, do you have the book with you? Would you like to read?
Sure. Okay.
Excellent.
Page 91. 2 forms of anti-Semitism. Hanukkah anti-Semitism doesn't demand dead or expelled Jews, at least not at first. Instead, it demands a destruction of Jewish civilization. This process requires not dead Jews, but Jews who are willing to give up whatever specific aspect of Jewish civilization is deemed to be uncool. Of course, Judaism has always been uncool, which is why cool people find it so threatening, and why Jews who are willing to become cool are absolutely necessary to Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism's success. In the days of Antiochus, This type of anti-Semitism needed those boys who voluntarily underwent painful genital surgery to prove that Jews weren't the problem, just the barbarity of Jewish law. Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism always promises Jews a kind of nobility, offering them the opportunity to cleanse themselves of whatever the people around them happen to find revolting. The Jewish traits designated as repulsive vary by country and time period, but they invariably contradict the specific values that the surrounding culture has embraced as universal. Thanks to Judaism's inherent uncoolness, there will never be a shortage of Jews willing to comply.
So this style of anti-Semitism, which we're calling Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism, Antiochus-style anti-Semitism, is very much the anti-Israel style of anti-Semitism, which we see today, and which unfortunately is attractive to many Jews. Because if you go to a college campus today, there's nothing more cool or popular that you can do than to be anti-Israel. You are considered to be cutting edge, because Israel is viewed as this evil imperialist nation, colonized another nation, exploiting minorities, the ultimate racist state. This is a colonizing state that has to be dismantled. But you ask these Jewish students, wait a minute, but does Israel have a right to exist? And they say no. And they don't just say the West Bank, they don't just say Gaza, but they actually say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Tzfat, every city in the land of Israel, every inch cleansed from the Jewish people. Doesn't that sound a little bit anti-Semitic? They say no, that's not anti-Semitic at all. We love Jews. We love the Jewish people. What are we against? We are against the violation of the human rights of the Palestinian people. All a Jew has to do is denounce their support for the state of Israel, and you could join us, and we absolutely love you. Right, this is classic form of Hanukkah anti-Semitism. So Jews join these movements because they believe these are the most progressive movements, and they are in fact going to cleanse Judaism and the Jewish people of this terrible stain of the state of Israel, the leading violator of human rights. And what do they say? This type of criticism of Israel cannot be anti-Semitic. What is their proof? Because I am Jewish, we are Jewish. If it's Jewish people who are saying it, therefore by definition, it cannot be anti-Israel. However, as we have mentioned, if there is demonization, if there is delegitimization, and if there's a double standard, it 100% is anti-Semitism. And the fact that there are Jews who have joined them is no contradiction at all. This is the classic Hanukkah form, Hanukkah style of anti-Semitism. So how do you stop Jews from joining this stuff? I mean, how do you prevent Jews from joining? So the answer, of course, is education, right? You have to improve, increase, and enhance pro-Israel education. We have to be able to teach Jews the legitimate claim that we have to the land of Israel. So what is it? What is the Jewish claim to the land of Israel that we need to educate people on? Now, the most common and the most popular arguments for the Jewish people's right and claim to the land of Israel, number one, comes from international law. The region which was known as Palestine had been ruled for centuries by the Ottoman Empire. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire was defeated. It was divided into different mandates. Great Britain had the mandate of Palestine. 1917, there's the Balfour Declaration that the Jewish people have a right to a homeland in what is known at that time as Palestine. Later, the League of Nations is formed, what ultimately became the UN, and Great Britain is given the job of actually creating a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. Finally, in 1947, The UN comes out with their partition plan, dividing the territory known as Palestine into two states, one Arab, one Jewish, even though that the division was probably a quarter of the size that it was when the discussions began. Israel accepted it. The vote was done. It passed. Israel became a legal state. It was granted its legitimacy by international law, by the UN. Another common argument is we need the state of Israel, and it is legitimate because of the need for Jewish survival. For 2,000 years, since the Jews were exiled from the land of Israel, we have suffered expulsions, crusades, pogroms, Holocausts, and we simply had nowhere to go when violence was being inflicted upon us. Even the United States, I'm sure everyone knows the story of the St. Louis, I believe it was called the St. Louis, a ship which sailed from Europe, the middle of the Holocaust, had 1,000 Jews on it. It sailed to Cuba, right? They had permits to go to Cuba. Ultimately, Cuba denied their entry. They wanted something like $1 million in 24 hours, something that was impossible. So this ship with 1,000 Jews on it tried to go to the United States. The United States sent the Coast Guard out, and they said, if you even get near Miami, we will fire on you. And that ship had to turn around, went straight back to Europe. England accepted about 200 Jews. The rest had to go right back to Europe, and almost every single one of them died in the concentration camps. That's the United States of America would not even accept Jews during the time of the Holocaust itself. No country was a home for the Jewish people. The Jewish people need a country, a government, an army that could defend itself, a place for Jewish people to go. So Jewish survival is a very common argument. Another very common argument is history. Going back from biblical times all the way to the conclusion of the Second Temple period, we have an incredible amount of archaeological evidence, not just religious and biblical evidence. The Jews controlling the land of Israel from biblical times to the Second Temple era is without a doubt a fact, right? Not speculation, it's a fact. In the 2,000 years since the Jews have been exiled from the land of Israel, there has been a constant and continuous presence of Jews living in the land of Israel. Dozens of times every single day, a Jew prays for their return to the land of Israel. Multiple blessings in the Amidah. Every benching, every grace after meals, even the little one paragraph that we say after eating a cookie, we pray to return to the land of Israel. At the conclusion of the holiest day of the year, Yom Kippur, what do we say? Lashana haba b'Yerushalayim, right after the shofar is blown next year in Jerusalem. At the conclusion of Pesach, the most observed Jewish holiday of the year, we say Lashana haba b'Yerushalayim. Right? We have this intense, incredible historical connection to the land of Israel. These are all very strong arguments. We need to teach them to young Jewish people. We need to teach them way better than we're doing it right now. Young people need to be exposed to the hypocrisy and the double standards of the anti-Israel movement. However, this is not a perfect solution. It's good, but it's not great, because there are many anti-Israel activists who already had this education. They actually had a very good pro-Israel education, and it did not help. To give an example, a very prominent anti-Israel critic named Phyllis Bennis, text number 5, page 94. Lisa, would you like to read text number 5, page 94? It looks like you are unmuted, but we do not hear you yet.
Okay, here
There
we
you
go. When a Jewish kid growing up in suburban Los Angeles, we thought being Jewish meant supporting Israel. There really wasn't a choice. If you identified as Jewish, as I and most of my friends did, the religious education we got, the youth groups we joined, and the summer camps where we played were all grounded in one thing. It wasn't God, it was Zionism. the political project settling Jewish people in Israel. My own break with Zionism came in my mid-20s after reading the letters of Zionism's founder, Theodore Herzl, imploring Cecil Rhodes, the leader of the British land left in Africa, to support his work in Palestine. Their projects were both something colonial, colonial, Herzl assured Rhodes.
So Phyllis was very proud. So Phyllis was raised in a very pro-Israel Jewish environment, as are many Jews who joined these anti-Israel movements. What was her issue? Her issue was the values that she was raised in, the values that were near to her heart. Her core values were human rights related issues. They were related to colonialism. Colonialism is an evil. And when she discovered that Herzl, who was the founder of the modern Zionist movement, used colonial style terminology, couldn't stomach it, couldn't tolerate it. She was opposed to that. These three arguments did not make a difference. They did not make a dent. They were irrelevant. She knew them. She can repeat them better than I could. It was still not an antidote because she had all the counter arguments. What are some of the counter arguments? Hey, international law, we're as legitimate as any other country. What do you mean we should disband? What is the response? The declaration by the UN was immoral. Just because it is the law doesn't make it right, doesn't make correct, doesn't make it just. Slavery was legal in the United States for centuries. That did not make it moral, that did not make it just. To take away land from the Palestinian people, this is illegitimate, this is immoral, this was wrong. No international law or sanction could change that. So they don't want to hear about that. Oh, and what about Jewish survival? Right, the Jewish people need a place to live. So they say, first of all, why does it have to be in Israel? If the Jewish people need a state in a very safe place, you know it's a great place to go? Northern Alaska, right? Northern Canada, right? Only you have a few moose and wolf over there. You have hundreds and hundreds of miles. You could establish a Jewish state. Why are you making a state on Palestinian land? You say it's to save the Jewish people? Excuse me, but you're surrounded by Arab countries that are not interested in you being there. Not only that, you're a target. If all the Jews are gathered in one location, God forbid one of these terrorist groups gets an atom bomb, a nuclear bomb, the amount of Jewish casualties will be terrible. By having Jews spread out all over the world, the Jews are actually more safe. And by the way, if anyone knows the mood and the feeling of Jews in the land of Israel before the Six-Day War, they were scared. They thought a second Holocaust might happen. And the country is literally going to be wiped out. Every Arab country around that targeting you, right? So they say Jewish survival, why Israel? Totally illegitimate. You talk about history, that the Jewish people have a right to become a history. Since when does your historical connection to a place generate some type of eternal right to the land? Did you know that the Greeks ruled Egypt for hundreds of years? Then it was ruled by the Romans, and only then by the Muslims which rule Egypt today. Does Greece have a right to claim Egypt because historically they had some control? Do the Dutch have the right to claim New York because they have a historic role? If anyone has a claim to the land of Israel, you know who it is? It's the Canaanites, because the Jewish people took the land of Israel away from the Canaanites. They have a better historical claim to the land of Israel than to the Jewish people. So even people who have been educated in the pro-Israel environment nevertheless still join these anti-Israel movements because these arguments are good, but they're simply not enough. There's something that's missing from the arguments. What is missing? Not just pro-Israel education, but what's missing is Jewish education. There was a man once wrote a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he said that our shul needed to get a minyan together for a yahrzeit. Phone calls for made. One Jew agrees to come to make number 10 of the minyan. Not only did he not open up a siddur to daven, but he sat and read the newspaper. This person was bothered, the person was offended, and writes this to the Rebbe. The Rebbe responded that the person who's reading the newspaper should not be criticized, should not be blamed. It's not his fault. Not only that, he should be complimented because he cares enough to actually help out the Jewish community and make a minyan. That person did not fail. We failed him. The Lubavitcher Rebbe says, don't be angry and frustrated with him. We as a Jewish community failed to educate him, to be inspired, to be motivated, to be excited, to open up a siddur and to daven with feeling and with emotion. The Rebbe said, we failed him. We failed him. The problem is our fault. If we would have given him a proper Jewish education, it would be completely different. The Rebbe said, had he received a proper Jewish education, his flame, the neshama which he has, the guy showed up to the minyan, could have been nurtured. Jewish people who join anti-Israel movements, they join because they have a neshama, they have a soul that's flickering, that's burning inside of them. They care about things. They care about goodness, they care about righteousness, they care about human rights. We failed them. We failed to educate them. What is the sum total of many of their Jewish educations? They were taught about tikkun olam. That is what Judaism is about, repairing the world, whether it's human rights, whether it's the climate. That is what they were taught about Jewish values. Jewish values would therefore include becoming anti-colonial, right? Anti-colonial. A Jew growing up from the perspective that Judaism equals tikkun olam, the glasses that they wear, boycott Israel. Israel is an apartheid state. It's in fact the Jewish values which they think they're upholding. It's the Jewish values that they think they are representing. Because if the only lens with which they view Israel is the political Zionism, and through the lens and the perspective of Theodor Herzl, from that perspective, absolutely they are going to be anti-colonial. However, if every single Jew would actually receive a full, complete, and comprehensive, in-depth Jewish education, and therefore they got their values from Judaism, from the Torah, right? Not from college professors, not from late night TV hosts, the lens would be entirely different. The lens, the attitude, the perspective which they would view what's going on in the Middle East would be totally and completely different. The key is young Jewish people need to learn about Israel from a Torah perspective, not from a political or nationalistic perspective. What does the Torah say is our claim to the land of Israel? Why is it legitimate? Because God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people. The first verse in the entire Torah, Bereshis bara Elokim, is in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. Rashi, most important, most critical, most prominent biblical commentator, the style of his commentary is to tell us what is the most straightforward, the most simple, the most literal interpretation of what the Torah is trying to say. He doesn't offer homilies, spirituality, mysticism. He tells you the reason why this verse exists. What's the meaning of the verse? This is it. He says straightforward. Yet he asks a question on the first verse. He says the Torah is a book of law. That's really what the word Torah means. It's a book of law. Why does the Torah begin with the creation of the world and all kinds of stories? There's a flood, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. The Jewish people go down to Egypt. They're slaves. Moshe redeems the Jewish people. It's a book of law. The first page, the Torah should open up. God commanded you to do X, Y, and Z. The first mitzvah, the first page, All the other stories could be the Talmud, they could be the Medrash, they can be in other places. The Torah is a book of law. Why do we discuss creation? And why is there all these stories, the patriarchs and the Exodus from Egypt? This is what he explains, text number 6. Jan, do you have the book? Would you like to read text number 6? Just unmute yourself and go for it, please.
What page is that on?
It is on page 95.
Rabbi Yitzhak stated, the Torah should have begun with the first mitzvah commanded to the Jewish people, which is contained in the verse, this month shall be to you, etc. Exodus 12:2. For what purpose does it start with? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The solution is found in the verse. He recounted the strength of his work to his people and to give them the inheritance of nations. Psalms 111.6. In other words, if the nations of the world accuse the Jews with the claim, you are thieves for having conquered the lands of 7 nations, the Jews would reply, the entire world is God's. He created it and granted it to whomever he desired. It was his will to initially give it to the 7 nations, and it was his will to subsequently remove it from them and give it to us.
So Rashi wrote these words living in France 1,000 years ago. And he was quoting a medrash that was written a good 400 or 500 years before that. And Rashi is telling us, what is the reason that the Torah begins with stories and not law? He says it's to tell us one message. The nations of the world are going to come and they're going to say, you have stolen the land of Israel. Don't give them Jewish survival. Don't give them Jewish history. Don't give them international law. The nations of the world then and today claim that the Jewish people stole the land of Israel. What is the response? The response is God created the world and he gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people. Marcus, are you available to read text number 7, which is on page 97? Just unmute yourself first, and then text 7 on page 97. Are you able to unmute yourself? There you go.
Okay, God told Abram, raise your eyes and look around from where you are to the north and south and to the east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you, your offspring forever.
This promise that all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever, that God chose to give a piece of it to us, and that this gift is eternal, is something that is repeated many, many times throughout the Torah. A Jew has to know that this is the foundation of our legitimacy and our claim to the land of Israel. All of the other ideas, which are good and important, Jewish survival history and international law, they sit on top of the foundation that we have a right to the land of Israel.
Rabbi,
Yes.
when you were in Olympia and you were getting all of these arguments, did you use Rashi's argument against them?
Yes, I actually taught a class on this topic, the first class that I ever taught at Evergreen. I actually have pictures of me teaching this class at Evergreen. And it was impactful. We had a handful of students who came, and it was impactful. It made a difference. The more that Jewish students actually came to any of the things that I did that had to do with Israel, there was an impact. There definitely was an impact. But at that campus, anti-Israel was so dominated that nobody would show up to anything that's pro-Israel. We brought in professors, authors of books, people who were professors in Middle East departments at prominent universities, showed films. Nobody showed up. They were boycotted. They're literally boycotted. So to get any message across was very difficult, but we learned, and I'll maybe get to a little bit later, over the years, we learned what messages work and what messages don't work. So next class, I'm going to talk about a lot of them that don't work. But the idea that I'm trying to communicate here is that if we raise the next generation of Jews without any knowledge or appreciation of Judaism, the Torah, of God, Israel education is ultimately going to be meaningless without a strong foundation. Without a strong foundation, it's shaky, it's weak, there's counter arguments, it's going to topple over. Only when there's a solid and strong foundation where Torah and God are exciting and relevant and meaningful to people, then Israel education has a solid foundation. Then you're going to have less Jews getting involved in anti-Israel activities. There has to be a foundation. Will this argument work that God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people for non-Jewish people? Will that convince them? Maybe yes, maybe no. But never underestimate the amount of religious people that are in the world, right? There's over 1 billion just Catholics, right? There's got to be 2-3 billion people are Christian who view the Bible as a holy book. So I'm not an expert on the Quran, but it's even possible that in the Quran it says that God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people, but I don't want to make that claim because I'm not an expert. I just remember hearing that somewhere. But the bottom line is, for Jews to know who they are, what we believe, what we stand for and represent, this is absolutely critical. Jews have to be strong in this. And the Rebbe made this exact point to the president of the state of Israel, to Shazar. All right, who would like to read that I did not call upon yet? Craig, would you like to read?
Which am I reading?
Text number 8 on page 98.
I have received complaints. Why do I invoke the biblical land of Israel, the Holy Land, and the covenant with Abraham in connection with modern Israel? Why do I mix God into the picture? After all, they say, those who fought for the creation of the state, those who led it, those who currently direct it, and its authorized representatives, they all proclaim and take pains to emphasize that Israel is a state founded in 1948. My answer, put frankly, is that their narrative is false. No new entity was created in 1948. Rather, that was the year in which a large part of the land of Israel was liberated. An entity established in 1948 based on the agreement or authorization of the nations of the world has no strength or justification in terms of an authentic response to the claim, you are thieves for having conquered lands belonging to others, etc. A claim raised by the Arabs, the Vatican, the United Nations, and some Jews as well. This is why it is so crucial to underscore that it is our God-given homeland. Now, I do not delude myself into imagining that these just and honest arguments will prevail in the United Nations, the Vatican, etc. Nevertheless, transmitting this truth is critical for the morale of Jewish youth living in the Holy Land, including those serving in the IDF, for Jewish American students, and for the Jewish youth of other countries as well.
When there is a soldier serving in the IDF, risking his life for Jews living in the land of Israel, or a Jew living in America, or a Jew living in France, why should they be pro-Israel? The arguments that are made to be pro-Israel have counter arguments. They're very shaky. But when a Jew knows that he is defending the land of Israel, which is given by God to the Jewish people and is our eternal home, there is no more true, real, and legitimate claim. It is the ultimate statement of legitimacy. And it gives strength to that Jew who's risking his life in Israel, and to the Jew and the college student in America and walking the streets in France. The result is a stronger Jewish people and less Jews joining Hanukkah-style anti-Israel anti-Semitism. Now, last week, we spent some time focusing on the spiritual underpinnings of anti-Semitism. We talked about Haman versus Ahasuerus. We talked about the ditch versus the mound, right? The ditch represents a spiritual emptiness. There's a void, there's a purposeless that some people have. And they see the Jew who is accomplishing, who's rising, who lives with purpose and meaning, and that causes a hatred and an animosity. A very similar principle we could apply to anti-Israel, anti-Semitism as well. There's a general question and then a specific question. The general question, where this is going to manifest, is why should the Jews claim ownership of this land? Right? Part of the underpinning of anti-Israel criticism and anti-Semitism, why should the Jews claim ownership of the land? But if we want to look at this question from a deeper perspective, a more spiritual perspective, this question isn't why should the Jews claim ownership of this land, it's why should the Jews claim ownership of this physical land? What do they mean by that? If Jewish identity is rooted in the Torah's spiritual practices, why do we need a land? Which other religion has a land that's tied down to it? Christians don't have a land. Islam does not have a land. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't places that are holy to people, but Christianity doesn't have a land. Islam does not have a land. Why does Judaism need a land? Not only that, the Jews had no land for 2,000 people, and we still have a religion to stay. So what right do Jews have a claim to say, our religion needs to have a land? Now, if we want to go more specifically into some of these questions, though we're running a little late, we may not have time to cover everything. Number one, why should the Torah even dignify the nations with an answer? The nations that you stole it. Every single land on earth was stolen. You think Italy is Italian, right? There was tribes warring and fighting and conquering this city, that city. Spain, it was Christian, it was Muslim, it was Christian again, it was Muslim again. England and France have been fighting each other forever. Parts of Spain were French, parts of Spain were English. I mean, this is going on forever. Israel has to somehow like defend itself. Every nation was conquered. Number two, isn't it odd for Torah to begin with this, right? Why is this like the most important statement to say at the beginning? What if the fourth book of the Torah was the story of creation, and in the fourth book it said God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people? Why does it have to be the first? Essentially, the answer is there's something different about the land of Israel than any other nation on earth. What's the difference? Every other nation is essentially bound by geography. We're talking about people who live in a very specific geographical border. As a result of them living in the geographical border, they have united, they've come together to protect those borders and to form a nation, a government, and a culture. However, the Jewish nation is not bound by geography, we're bound by Torah. Before the Jewish people were ever a nation in the land of Israel, we became a nation as we left Egypt, and we became a nation when God gave to us the Torah before that. It's the Torah which has allowed us to survive for the past 2,000 years. Text number 9 is a one-liner, I'm going to read it. The Jewish nation is only a nation through its Torah. Text number 10, The Secret of Jewish Immortality, Karen Melton. Could you please read? Would you mind? Text number 10, page 102.
Sure. An objective, unprejudiced survey of the long history of our people will at once bring to light the reality that our survival as a nation was not the result of material wealth or physical strength. Even during the most prosperous times under the united monarchy of King Solomon, the Jewish people, as well as its country, were materially insignificant by comparison with contemporary world empires such as Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia. Nor was it our active statehood or the control of our geographic homeland that secured our existence, as is evidenced from the reality that for the vast majority of our history, our people have lived in exile, without a kingdom and without a homeland. Similarly, our Hebrew language did not play a vital role in our perpetuation, for even in biblical times, Aramaic supplanted the holy tongue as a spoken language to the extent that parts of the scripture, almost all of our Babylonian Talmud, the Zohar, and other key works were composed in Aramaic instead of Hebrew. Later, in the times of Rabbi
Sadia Gaon.
thank you, and Maimonides, most of the Jewish masses spoke Arabic, and further down the line was Yiddish and other languages. It is also impossible to ascribe other common secular culture or contemporary scientific knowledge as a major preservation factor for our people, since such matters morphed radically from one era to another. The only remaining consideration, which is the sole factor that has remained consistent throughout the ages in all lands and under the fullest diversity of circumstance, is the Torah and mitzvot that the Jews have observed in their daily life with great self-sacrifice.
Every other nation absolutely requires a land to be a nation. Can't be a nation without a land. But based on the text that we just said, it's the Torah that makes the Jewish people, not a land. Therefore, the Gentiles of the world come along and say, you actually stole the land of Israel because you don't need a land. You have the Torah, you have spirituality, you have mitzvahs. You don't need the land of Israel. Your claim to the land of Israel is absolutely illegitimate, and you are thieves. Comes along the Torah, right? And the Torah says, not in the fourth book of the Torah, but in the very first book of the Torah, not just the first book of the Torah, but the very first words of the Torah. And what does the Torah say? God created the world, and God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people. You know why? Because God created the world for a purpose. And the Jewish people play a critical and vital role in the purpose of creation. We are meant to be a light unto the nations. We do that through observing the Torah. Where is the physical location where the Jews are meant to fulfill this purpose in the most ideal and in the most perfect way? The land of Israel. The Torah cannot be observed in completeness and fullness and wholeness outside the land of Israel. Half of the mitzvahs do not apply outside the land of Israel. So the very identity of the Jewish people is to fulfill the purpose of creation, be a light unto the nations, as we talked about last week. That leaves a void and an emptiness in people who are doing nothing with their life. It results in anti-Semitism. The land of Israel is given to the Jewish people to be the place where we fulfill our mission of being a light into the nations. Therefore, it causes the exact same type of anti-Semitism, anti-Israel hatred, because it reminds them that they're not living up to their purpose as well. So to answer the question that we asked at the beginning of the class, why are Gentile college students in Olympia, Washington, obsessed with anti-Israel activity? Why the UN? Why the media? Why, of all the stuff that's going on in the world, Israel is the country that they're focusing on? Why are they obsessed? It's the same reason that people hate the Jewish people. It's the same reason that they hate Israel. Because the world was created for a purpose. And the land of Israel is central to the reason that the world was created. Because the land of Israel is central to the reason the world was created, everybody's eyes are on it. People in Olympia, Washington, and around the world, their eyes are glued, they're focused on what happens in the land of Israel, because what happens in the land of Israel matters so much. It's critical to the purpose of the creation of the world. And what is our job? To be a light unto the nations. To conclude, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, he lived 1075 to 1141. He was a prominent Jew in Spain. He was a physician. He was a poet. He was wealthy. He was a diplomat, very influential. He wrote, "My heart is in the east, and I in the uttermost west. How can I find savor in food? How shall it be sweet to me? How shall I render my vows and my bonds? While yet Zion lieth beneath the fetter of Edom, and I in Arab chains. A light thing would it be to leave all the good things of Spain and go to the land of Israel. Could you imagine a person who's living in the golden age of Spain, powerful, influential, wealthy, involved in the government, and he says, my heart is in the East. I might live in the West. My passion, my soul, it's in Israel. I can't even enjoy the flavor of food because I'm not in the land of Israel. He views himself being in Arab chains, and it would be the best and easiest thing to be able to go to the land of Israel. That's the feeling that Jews have had for the past few thousand years. And we can develop similar sentiments today, and we can pass them on to the next generation. How? By providing a rich, complete, and full Jewish education. That is going to be the foundation of their education. Fostering a love for God, developing an appreciation for the Torah. And Israel education is ultimately going to be the result of that. When Jewish students receive that type of education, they're not going to be joining the anti-Israel movements anymore. And ultimately, the anti-Israel threat itself will be removed and will merit the coming of Mashiach, the rebuilding of the third temple, and will all once again return to the land of Israel, peace in the land of Israel, and peace in the rest of the world as well.
Lesson 3, the Promised Land. 1. Anti-Semitism seeks legitimacy from the most prestigious authority of any given era. At present, this authority is the pursuit of human rights. Consequently, many of today's anti-Semites focus overwhelmingly on Israel and accuse it of being the ultimate violator of human rights. 2. When Israel is A, demonized, or B, judged with a double standard, or C, when Israel's existence is delegitimized, the challenge exposes itself as an expression of anti-Semitism. 3. When anti-Semites refrain from asserting that they seek to annihilate Jewry, but merely take issue with specific Jewish beliefs or practices, claiming them to be barbaric, Jews can be tempted to join the fight against their fellow Jews, believing that they are saving Jews rather than hurting them. 4. There are several arguments for why Jews need and have a right to Israel. Most crucial is the Torah's oft-reiterated reminder that God gave Jews the land of Israel as an eternal inheritance. The deeper our appreciation of this reality, and the more we educate the next generation about its implications, the more support we will nourish toward the land of Israel. Such an approach can desirably influence the wider audience, but the most vital audience is our Jewish brothers and sisters. 5. To support Torah and God-based reasoning, it is necessary to create an environment that cherishes the Torah and nurtures faith. It is therefore critical to provide a robust Jewish education to ourselves and to the next generation. 6. Jews are a nation not because of our land, but because of our Torah. Nevertheless, the land is important to the Torah's vision for the world, inasmuch as it embodies the Jewish mission on earth, to infuse physicality with holiness.
Next week, right, we have to discuss if we're going to be having class on Wednesday night. It is Erev Thanksgiving. Does anyone have any issue with having class on Erev Thanksgiving? Now, okay, I can't see everyone, so hold on just a second. One more point, then we'll discuss this. Continue learning, myjlad.com/antisemitism. Also, at the end of your student book, there's more information. All men are invited to steak and scotch night at the shul, Monday, November 22nd, 6 p.m. Please RSVP. It's going to be a lot of fun. On Tuesday next week, Yud Tes Kislev Farbrengen, Rabbi Yossi Goldman. He's inspiring, he's fabulous, the rabbi of the largest shul in the Southern Hemisphere in Johannesburg. Andrew Cohen, who is on the class tonight, he grew up in South Africa. He went to that shul, loves him. He highly recommends. You must go and RSVP. You'll enjoy. All right, Wednesday, Thanksgiving Eve, lesson number 4. Who can come? Who's able to come?
We
All
can
right.
come. We'll be
I
on
can
there.
come.
Okay, it looks to me like just about everyone is able to attend. Yes,
Yes.
Bill is not going to be able to attend.
I may be traveling. I'm not sure where I'll be 7:30 on Wednesday.
Okay. It seems to me, though, the majority can do Wednesday nights. So we will do the class live Wednesday night. It will be recorded and everyone can watch and see and have the link, and I will email it out. All right, so that makes life a little bit easier. All right, any questions, comments?
Yeah, I got one. I'll go.
Yes.
My opinion of Finkelstein and his partner in crime, Chomsky, is somewhere between the Titanic and the ocean floor. Just because you got a PhD at MIT doesn't mean you got much of a seichel at all. But the question I have, I've had to sit and try to stomach their comments for years. I've listened to a lot of debates between him and Dershowitz and so on, whether it's Chomsky or Finkelstein versus Dershowitz or whoever else. But have you or any of the other members of the class ever heard either of those two actually offer praise to Israel on anything, on any kind, on any level? Because all I hear is condemnations by them against Israel and every excuse in the world and praise of every one of Israel's enemies. But I've never once heard either of these two very educated guys praise Israel about anything of their achievements. So I'll leave the floor open for that.
They have not. I certainly have not heard it. But as we're going to discuss, I believe in next week, and I definitely want to share some other insights I have, even if it's not covered directly in the course. Praises of Israel, even the most true and legitimate ones, have no impact and no effect at all on anti-Israel people. It doesn't work. Calling out people as being evil is the only thing that's going to have an effect. When people truly recognize and appreciate what it is that Hamas and groups like that stand for and what Hezbollah stand for, they won't get it. Until they recognize that the ideology of Hezbollah and Hamas literally is the same thing, right, as what Nazis are advocating, it's not gonna process through their head. Because from their perspective, it doesn't matter how much technology Israel has, how much medical technology Israel has, it doesn't matter. They don't care that Israel will go to Haiti and build hospitals and save the lives of people. From their perspective, Israel is a bunch of racists and colonialists and violators of human rights. So those arguments, unfortunately, I've seen it. We've done it, right? We brought out a speaker to talk about what Israel is doing for water, right? Taking ocean water, turning it into water, desalinization. They don't care. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to come. That they're not interested. This information has no effect. And any of the pro-Israel organizations who think that they're going to go to a campus and they talk about how Israel has LGBTQ rights and has a gay pride parade, it makes no difference. It is falling on deaf ears. There's no audience for it. It doesn't help the anti-Israel Gentiles. It does not help the anti-Israel Jews either. Without a proper, true Jewish education and a feeling of closeness to the land of Israel and to the Jewish people, without that foundation, everything falls and topples. It ultimately does not work. And we have to have the ability to call a spade a spade. Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Hamas, all these people, they're Jew haters and Jew killers, right? And if you don't get that, it ain't gonna happen, right? It's not, nothing's gonna work. Anyone else have any, yes, Marcus.
Yeah. It says Jews are a nation not because of our land, but because of our Torah. Doesn't the military help to maintain the Jewish nation as a nation?
It certainly does, but the Jewish people have been a nation for 3,000 years. We were a nation before we lived in the land of Israel, and for the past 2,000 years, when the state of Israel did not exist, we were still the Jewish nation. In 1492, the Jewish people were still the Jewish nation. In 1812, the Jewish people were still the Jewish nation. It's the Torah that makes us a Jewish nation, not the land. Is the land vital and critical? Absolutely. The land was given to us by God eternally. It's our land whether we live there or don't live there. And it's given to us in order for us to best be able to fulfill our mission. But at the same time, it's the Torah that makes us the Jewish people, not the land of Israel.
But like I
Yes,
said,
Phil.
to maintain the land, you need a strong military.
Absolutely. You need the strongest of militaries, 100%. Phil, you had a question?
Yeah, in Rashi's comments, he talks about Hashem granting, initially granting the whatever they granted to seven.
Canaanites, yeah.
Yeah, to the 7 nations.
Yeah.
They subsequently gave it to the Jewish people. Who were the 7 nations?
So the Torah lists out the 7 nations. They're the Hittites and all kinds of different. There's a whole list of them that the Torah has. Multiple times it mentions who they were. They were living there at the time, and then God gave it to the land of Israel. And when the Jewish people approached the land of Israel, they said to them, God has given the land of Israel to us. If you would like to leave peacefully, that would be the ideal scenario. If not, there's going to be a war. And one of them actually said, you know what? We're going to do the whole peace thing, right? And did not go to battle. But yes, there were those 7 nations who had lived in the land of Israel before the Jewish people.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much for joining. Definitely a lot to think about and to reflect upon. And God willing, we'll continue the discussion next week. How do we deal with anti-Israel politicians and things of that nature in the broader world? So have a good night, and we'll see you next week.